The claret went down the front of her gown in a single dark stroke, and the whole ballroom heard the laughter before it heard the glass. "Oh, forgive me," said Lady Cruella Vane, holding the emptied goblet at arm's length as though it had acted without her. "But truly, Miss Ashby, what harm? One can hardly ruin a thing that was never fine to begin with." From the shadow of the north colonnade, where he had stood unnoticed for the better part of an hour, Gideon, Duke of Jessamy, set down his own untouched glass on a marble ledge and heard the small click of it as if it were a pistol cocking. He had come to the Ferrers' ball for one reason only, and he had been watching that reason cross the room with a folded shawl over her arm when the circle closed on her. He had seen the whole of it. He had seen Lady Cruella step deliberately into her path. He had seen Mr. Crispin Alderley, who wore his cravat like a man wearing a title he had not earned, murmur something to his friends and lift the wine. He had seen Miss Tamsin Ashby stop and lift her chin and wait with the terrible patience of a woman who has learned that flinching only lengthens the sport. And then the wine, spread across pale muslin, that plain gown of hers, the colour of a wound in candlelight. It ran to the hem. It spotted the toe of one worn slipper. The circle of fashionable young people laughed, and because they laughed, others laughed, and because others laughed, the laughter travelled outward through the room like a ripple through standing water, until 80 people were laughing at a girl who had done nothing but walk across a floor. She did not cry. That was the thing that took the breath out of him, though he could not have said afterwards whether it was rage or something far more dangerous. She stood in the middle of that ring of silks and diamonds with claret creeping down her skirts, and she did not cry, and she did not run, and she did not beg. She only looked once at Lady Cruella with an expression Gideon had seen before, on the faces of men who had held a line under fire and knew they would not be relieved. "It is only wine," Tamsin Ashby said quietly. "It will wash." "It will not," said Lady Cruella sweetly. "Muslin never does. But then you shall have the pleasure of wearing it again next season and next, and we shall all know you by it." Somewhere behind her a fiddle faltered. The musicians in the gallery, sensing something, had let the country dance thin to nothing. The floor had emptied. The whole great room, gilded and glittering, 400 candles burning in 3 chandeliers of Bohemian crystal, turned itself toward the small spectacle at its center and waited to be entertained. Gideon stepped out of the colonnade. He was not a man who had to make room for himself. The crowd knew him before it saw him. There was a stir, a drawing back, the hush that comes when a large dog rises unexpectedly in a warm parlor. He was aware of it and did not care. He crossed 40 feet of parquet with the whole assembly parting for him, and he did not look at Lady Cruella, and he did not look at Alderley, and he did not look at Lady Ferrers, who had begun to move toward the disturbance with her hands out and her mouth open, and who now stopped where she stood. He looked at Tamsin Ashby. She had not seen him. Her eyes were fixed on some point above the heads of her tormentors, that soldier's stare, and it was only when the shadow of him fell across her ruined skirts that she turned her head and found him standing close enough that she had to look up. He watched something move behind her face. Not hope. She was past hope, he thought, and the thought was a cold hand on his heart. What moved there was a kind of bracing, as if she believed that the last and heaviest blow was now about to fall, and had decided in advance to take it standing. That, more than the wine, was what he could not forgive. He reached up, unhurried, and unfastened the clasp of his cloak. It was a heavy thing, black, lined with sable, worth more than the whole of the Ferrers' plate. He swung it from his own shoulders and settled it around hers, and drew it closed across the stain, and fastened the clasp beneath her chin with his own hands. His knuckles brushed her jaw. He felt her breath stop. "Miss Ashby," he said, "Your Grace." Her voice was steady. It cost her something. He could see that it cost her something, and she paid it. "You are cold," he said, though the room was stifling, and gave her the lie as a gift, and saw her take it. Then only then he turned around. 80 faces, perhaps 100. Lady Cruella Vane still held the empty goblet, and her smile had not yet learned what her eyes already knew. Crispin Alderley had gone the colour of tallow. Behind them stood their little court, 4 or 5 of them, all young, all beautifully dressed, all suddenly and profoundly interested in the pattern of the floor. Gideon did not raise his voice. He had learned long ago that a raised voice is a confession of weakness, and that a quiet one, in a silent room, carries into every corner like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. Lady Pruella, he said, you appear to have spilled your wine. Your Grace, it was the merest accident, the crush. You know how one is jostled. I was watching, said Gideon. The words went into the silence and lay there. I was standing beneath the north colonnade, he continued in the same unhurried tone, for 1 hour and some minutes. I saw you set down your fan upon the pier table so that your hand should be free. I saw you step into a path. I saw Mr. Alderley hand you a full glass, having drunk none of it himself, which I confess struck me at the time as an act of unusual self-denial in a young man of his habits. A sound went through the room, not quite laughter, something more nervous. I saw you pour it, deliberately, slowly. With attention, madam, to the distribution. Lady Pruella's mouth opened and shut. So let us not speak of accidents, Gideon said. It insults the room. It insults me. And it insults, most of all, the lady you have chosen to make sport of, who has borne it better than any of us here would have borne it, and who has not, I observe, told a single lie in her own defence, a distinction she now enjoys alone in this company. Your Grace, Alderley began, if I may only explain. You may not. Gideon let that sit. Then he did the thing that would be repeated in every drawing-room in the county by Thursday, and in the town houses of the capital by the following week, and which he had decided upon somewhere in the middle of that long walk across the floor. He turned back to Tamsin Ashby, and he took her hand, and he raised it, and he set his lips to her fingers before the whole assembly, and he held them there a moment longer than any man might who was merely being gallant. Then he straightened, still holding her hand, and faced the room. You have all been labouring under a misapprehension, he said. You have supposed Miss Ashby to be nobody, a companion, a poor relation, a woman without protection, and therefore fair game for the amusement of persons who have never in their lives been obliged to be brave about anything. His voice did not rise. It only cooled degree by degree, until it might have frosted the crystal. Permit me to correct you. 3 weeks ago at Jessamy Court I asked Sir Marcus Ashby for the honour of his cousin's hand. 6 days ago he gave it. I had intended to make the thing known at my own time and in my own manner, but Lady Pruella has been kind enough to relieve me of the choice. The room made a sound he had never heard a room make before. It was not a gasp. It was closer to the noise of a great animal turning over in sleep. He felt Tamsin's fingers go rigid in his. He did not look at her. He could not yet, not without the whole assembly reading in his face precisely how much of this was policy and how much of it was not policy at all. He kept his eyes on Lady Pruella Vane, who had gone from white to a mottled and dreadful red, and who was now very slowly understanding the shape of the hour she had made for herself. The wine upon that gown, he said, was poured upon the future Duchess of Jessamy, in her own hearing, before 400 candles and every family of consequence in the shire. I mention it only so that no one here should imagine in a week's time that they had misunderstood the matter. He let go of nothing. He simply stood there with Tamsin Ashby's hand in his and let the silence do its work, and it did it very thoroughly. Lady Ferrers, he said at last, without turning. The hostess came forward, wringing her hands, her turban trembling. Your Grace, Miss Ashby, my dear Miss Ashby, I am sure I never. The room is so full, and I did not. You will send for your housekeeper, Gideon said, and Miss Ashby will be shown to a private chamber, and she will have hot water and whatever is needful, and she will be attended by a person of sense rather than a person of curiosity. You will do this now. At once, Your Grace. At once. And Lady Ferrers, now he did turn, and he saw the woman flinch from whatever was in his face. When my carriage comes for her, she will walk out of this house through the front hall, not the garden door, not the servants' stair. The front hall, madam, and the entire company will be standing in it. He heard, very faintly at his shoulder, the smallest indrawn breath, and he thought, with a lurch he could not govern, that it might have been the beginning of a laugh, or the end of a sob, and that in either case he would have given the whole of Jessamy Court to know which. Then Tamsin Ashby said, so quietly that only he could hear it, "You did not ask me." And Gideon, Duke of Jessamy, who had faced a French battery at Salamanca and had not once in his life been frightened by a woman, discovered that his mouth had gone perfectly dry. He did not answer her then. There was no answering such a thing in a room that was holding its breath. He handed her to Lady Ferrers' housekeeper with a bow that the whole assembly saw and understood, and he stood at the foot of the great stair with his hands behind his back while she climbed it in his sable cloak, and he did not move until she was out of sight. Then he turned and looked at the ballroom, and the ballroom found that it had a very great deal to say to itself in low voices about anything at all except Miss Tamsin Ashby. It was quite true what he had told them. He had asked. Sir Marcus Ashby had said yes, had said it in the shaking, delighted, faintly greedy manner of a country baronet who cannot believe his luck, and who had never once in 9 years thought to buy his cousin a decent gown out of the pension he administered on her behalf. Gideon had noted that at the time and filed it and said nothing. What he had not told them, what he had told no one, and did not intend to, was why it had begun in November in the rain on the Ashby road. His curricle had thrown a wheel 2 miles from anywhere, and he had been walking, filthy and furious, with his coat over his arm and his temper in a condition his steward would have recognized. At a bend where the hedgerow broke, he came upon a farm cart tipped into the ditch, an old man pinned by the leg beneath a fallen churn, and a girl in a grey cloak kneeling in the mud with her shoulder under the shaft. She was not strong enough. Anyone could see she was not strong enough. She was doing it anyway. "Do not stand there," she had said, without looking up, without the least idea who he was. "Take his other side, and mind the wheel, it will run back." He had taken the other side. They got the churn off between them. Gideon set the man's leg with a hedge stake and his own cravat while the girl held the old fellow's head in her lap and talked to him, not in the cooing way of ladies visiting the poor, but steadily, practically, of his daughter in Kettering and the price of cheese, and how she would send word tonight, and no, she would not let them take his leg, she would see to it herself. Her hands were black to the wrist, her cloak was ruined, she never once asked Gideon's name. When the farm men came at last with a hurdle, she stood and swayed, and put out a hand to the hedge, and Gideon caught her elbow. "You will want a surgeon in the morning," he said. "Send to Jessamy Court and one will come." She had looked at him then, properly, for the first time, and he watched the recognition arrive, and watched her decide that she would not be frightened of it. "I am obliged to you, sir," she said. "But he is a tenant of my cousin's, not of yours, and if I send to Jessamy Court my cousin will be told of it, and the old man will be turned off the land for having troubled a duke." A pause. "I shall find the money another way." "What way?" "There is a way," said Miss Ashby, and would say no more, and walked off into the rain with her ruined cloak about her. He learned the way 3 weeks later from his own surgeon, who mentioned in passing that a young lady had brought him a small pearl brooch and asked what it might fetch, and had been very insistent that the fee be paid in advance, and the patient told the treatment was a charity of the parish. Gideon had sat with that for a long time. He had spent his life among people who performed goodness the way they performed the quadrille, correctly, publicly, and with an eye to the audience. He had never in his 38 years met a person who did a kindness in the mud, in the rain, at their own cost, and then went to some trouble to ensure that nobody ever knew of it. He had believed such people existed only in sermons, and he had privately doubted the sermons. So he had made inquiries, quiet ones. He learned that Tamsin Ashby was the orphan of a clergyman, that she had been taken into her cousin's house at 16 as an unpaid companion to Sir Marcus's mother, and that when the old lady died she had simply stayed on, because there was nowhere else. He learned she had had a small inheritance and that Sir Marcus administered it, and that nobody could say precisely where the interest went, though Sir Marcus's stables were very fine. He learned that she read to the blind sexton on Tuesdays, that she had sat up 9 nights with a scarlet fever family the whole village had abandoned, and that she had been laughed at for her gowns at every assembly in the county for 4 years, and had gone on attending them, because her cousin's wife required a companion, and it was not, in the end, her choice to make. And he learned, from a groom, that she sang in the stable yard when she thought no one could hear her, and stopped the instant anyone came. Gideon of Jessamy had been hunted for 11 years by every ambitious mother in England. He had been flattered, courted, waylaid, and once memorably locked into a conservatory. He had grown into a man who assumed, as a matter of course, that any warmth turned toward him was warmth turned toward the estate, the title, and the 11,000 a year. And here was a woman who had knelt in a ditch beside him without asking his name, and refused his help when it might have cost an old man his cottage, and sold her mother's brooch rather than be thanked for it. In January he rode to Ashby and asked Sir Marcus for her hand. He had asked the cousin first, and not her, and he had told himself at the time that this was correct, that it was the form, that a man does not lay a proposal before a woman who has no means of refusing it without insult. But standing now at the foot of Lady Farah's staircase with the taste of his own words still in his mouth, "You did not ask me." He understood that he had done it in the way he had done everything for 11 years. He had arranged, he had commanded. He had settled the matter as one settles a matter of business, because he had been afraid, in some place he did not visit often, that if he asked her plainly she might look at him with those steady eyes and say no. His carriage was brought round at midnight. She came down the stairs into a front hall packed to the walls with the entire company, exactly as he had ordered, and she came down in her stained gown with his cloak over her arm rather than on her shoulders and her head up, and the claret dark as old blood on the muslin for every soul in the shire to see. She might have hidden it. He saw at once that she had chosen not to. He met her at the last step. He was aware of Lady Cruella Vane pressed back against the wainscot with her aunt's hand clamped round her wrist. He was aware of Alderley gone. He was aware chiefly of 80 pairs of eyes. "Your Grace," said Tamsin Ashby, and offered him the cloak. "You will want this. The night is cold." "Keep it. It is sable, Your Grace. It is worth a year of me." "Then it is worth very little," said Gideon, "and you should not scruple to take it." And she laughed. It was the smallest sound. It escaped her before she could prevent it, and she pressed her lips together at once and looked away, and colour came up in her face for the first time all evening. But he had heard it, and he found that his heart was behaving in a manner that would have alarmed his physician, and he thought, with a clarity that startled him, "There it is." That was the thing he had been standing about in cold colonnades for. He put her into the carriage himself. She did not thank him on the drive. She sat opposite him in the dark with her hands in her lap, and the lamps swung and the hedges went by, and at last she said, "They will not forgive you for it, you know." "For what?" "For making them witnesses." She turned her face to the window. "If you had struck Mr. Alderley, they would have forgiven you by Sunday. Men understand being struck, but you made 100 people stand still and be shown what they are, and they will hate you for it, and they cannot hate you, because you are the Duke of Jessamy." A pause. "So they will hate me." Gideon watched her profile in the lamplight and said nothing, because she was entirely right. They began on the Tuesday. It was done with the exquisite politeness of people who have learned that a knife is more genteel than a fist. Mrs. Corliss Vane, Lady Cruella's aunt, and the arbiter of every guest list within 30 miles, called upon 3 houses, and let it be understood with great sorrow that a certain young person had been seen at the Farah's ball behaving in a manner calculated to attract attention, and that the wine, so unfortunate, had been quite the least of it. The word designing was used, the word artful. Someone remembered that the girl had spent 9 nights in a fever house, and it was suggested delicately that a woman who was not afraid of scarlet fever was probably not afraid of very much else. A tradesman in the market town refused Sir Marcus's credit. A card party at Halloway was got up, and Miss Ashby was not asked. In the parish church on Sunday, the pew that had held her for 9 years was found to be occupied, by arrangement, and she stood in the aisle for the length of a minute in front of the whole congregation before the sexton's blind old father, who could not see her, and did not need to, rapped his stick on the flags and said, in the enormous voice of the deaf, "Miss Ashby, my dear, there is room by me." Gideon heard of all of it. He heard of it because he had a valet with cousins in every kitchen in the county, and because he had begun, in a manner he was not proud of, to want to know everything. He did not intervene. He wanted to. He very nearly rode to Mrs. Vane's door on the Wednesday, and he sat on his horse at the end of her avenue for 11 minutes, and then turned back, because a thing had occurred to him that he could not put down, that every rescue he had performed so far had been performed over Tamsin Ashby's head. He had asked her cousin. He had announced her betrothal to a ballroom before he had spoken a word of it to her. He had given her his cloak without inquiring whether she wished for it. She had told him plainly what it would cost her, and he had said nothing, and she had not asked him to fix it. So he waited. It was the hardest fortnight of his life, and on the Friday, word came to Jessamy Court that Miss Ashby had walked 4 miles into the market town in the rain, gone into the shop of the tradesman who had refused her cousin's credit, and paid the whole of the outstanding accounting coin she had got, the report ran, by selling the last of her mother's things, and had said to the man, before 6 customers, "You were quite right to refuse the credit, Mr. Pell. It was never good. The debt was honest, and it is paid, and I will trouble you to say so to Mrs. Vane when she calls on Tuesday, as she certainly will." Gideon read the note twice. Then he called for his horse. He found her on the Ashby road, 2 miles from anywhere, at the bend where the hedgerow broke. She was walking home in the rain with an empty basket on her arm and her boots gone to ruin, and she stopped when she saw him, and stood very still in the middle of the road as he swung down out of the saddle. "Your Grace." Miss Ashby. He was aware that he had rehearsed nothing, and that this was the first entirely honest hour of his adult life. "You said that I did not ask you." The rain came down between them. "I am asking you now," said Gideon, "not your cousin, not the room, you. And I will tell you first what you are entitled to know, which is that you may refuse me, and that if you refuse me I will settle upon you an independence sufficient to take you out of your cousin's house and out of this county tomorrow, and you will never be obliged to look at me again. That stands whatever you answer. I will not have your yes bought." Her chin came up. He had learned to read that. "Then why should I say it?" "Because in November," said Gideon, "you knelt in that ditch precisely there, and put your shoulder under a shaft you could not lift, and did not ask my name. Because you sold your mother's brooch to pay a surgeon, and then went to some trouble to see that the old man was told it was the parish. Because you have been laughed at in every assembly room in this shire for 4 years, and you go on going, and you go on being decent to the people who laugh." He heard his own voice roughen and did not attempt to smooth it. "I have been hunted for 11 years by women who wanted Jessamy Court. You are the only creature I have ever met who would not take it as a gift. That is why I chose you. Not for pity, madam. Do not do me the injustice of thinking it was pity. I chose you because you are the bravest person I have ever stood beside, and I have stood beside soldiers." Tamsin Ashby did not speak for a long moment. "I have nothing," she said at last. "You know I have nothing. You have everything I have never been able to buy. They will say I trapped you. They will," Gideon agreed, "for about a fortnight. Then they will say they always knew it, and they will fight for a place at your table, and they will lie about having been at the Pharaoh's ball at all." He took one step closer. "Miss Ashby, Tamsin, I am not asking you to be a duchess. I am asking you to be my wife, and I am asking very badly, in the rain on a public road, because I find I cannot wait until I can do it well." He watched her face, and for the first time since he had known her, he could not read it. Then she set down the basket in the mud, and put out her hand, and laid it flat against his chest, over his coat, over his heart, where she must have felt exactly what it was doing, and said yes. He did not kiss her then. He wanted to. He stood in the road with her hand on his chest, and the rain running off the brim of his hat, and he raised her fingers instead and pressed his mouth to them, and held them there, and felt her other hand come up hesitant and settle against his jaw, and that was more than kissing. And both of them knew it. The wedding was set for the last week of March, and the county, having nothing else to talk of, talked of nothing else. Mrs. Corliss Vane made her final calculation and made it badly. She let it be known that she would not attend, that she could not, in conscience, countenance so unequal a match, and that she had every expectation of being followed in this by all persons of feeling. Lady Pruella was seen in a new bonnet, smiling. Gideon received the intelligence over breakfast and set it down beside his coffee and did nothing whatever about it, which cost him a very great deal. But he did do one thing. He wrote in his own hand 400 cards of invitation. And at the foot of each, beneath the seal of Jessamy, he added a single line, identical on every card. "The Duke of Jessamy requests the honour of your presence at the marriage of Miss Tamsin Ashby, who was at Lady Ferrers's ball in November, publicly insulted in the sight of this county, and who bore it better than any of us." They came. Every one of them came. There was not a family within 40 miles that dared to be the family that had stayed away. Jessamy Court had not been opened for a great occasion in 19 years. The long gallery was lit end to end with wax tapers, the hall chandeliers Bohemian crystal, 500 candles threw light down onto marble that had been scrubbed for a week. And into it, at 11 in the morning, came Tamsin Ashby on the arm of a blind old sexton's father who had insisted upon the office and had been given it, 'cause Gideon had asked her whom she wished to walk with her and had, for once, listened to the answer. Her gown was ivory silk with Brussels lace at the sleeves. She had chosen it herself. Gideon had sent a mantua maker from town with 16 patterns and instructions to give her whatever she asked for, and she had asked for one gown plainly cut, and had sent the rest back. But at the throat she wore a string of pearls that had been his mother's, and on her finger, when he took her hand at the altar rail, was the Jessamy ring too large for her, wound about with a thread of blue silk to make it fit. He looked at that thread of blue silk and could not, for a moment, say his part. The vicar waited. 400 people waited. Gideon of Jessamy stood in his own chapel with the woman's hand in his, and thought of a grey cloak in the mud and a girl's voice saying, "Take his other side, and mind the wheel," and he got his voice back and said what he had come to say, and meant every syllable of it. Afterwards, in the long gallery, with the county eating his mutton and drinking his wine, he did the last of it. He did not make a speech. He simply took his wife's hand and walked her the length of the gallery, and stopped in front of Mrs. Corliss Vane and Lady Pruella, who had come and who had been placed, by his own arrangement, and he was not ashamed of it, in full view of the room. The gallery went quiet. "Mrs. Vane," said Gideon, "Lady Pruella, my wife has asked me a favour this morning, and as it is the first she has ever asked, I find I am unable to refuse her." He looked down at Tamsin, "Madam." And Tamsin, Duchess of Jessamy, in her ivory silk, with her pearls and her borrowed thread of blue, said clearly, "I have asked His Grace to receive you at Jessamy Court whenever you should call. You will always be admitted. A pause no longer than a heartbeat. I hope you will call often. I should like the county to see how kindly I can bear it." Nobody laughed. It was far too quiet for laughing. Lady Pruella Vane went the colour of ash and curtsied, because there was nothing else in the world left for her to do, and her aunt curtsied lower, and they were finished. Not driven out, not disgraced, not struck, simply finally and forever placed. Mercy, offered before 400 witnesses by the woman they had poured wine on, is a heavier sentence than any a duke can pronounce, and every soul in that gallery knew it. Gideon looked at his wife with something close to awe. "You did not tell me you would say that," he murmured. "You did not ask me," said Tamsin, and this time he laughed, out loud, in front of the whole county, a sound nobody in that room had ever heard from the Duke of Jessamy in their lives. They were 3 years married when he came home one December evening late, cold to the bone from the Ashby Road, and found her in the small parlour at the west end of the house. Not the state rooms, never the state rooms. She had chosen this one, with its low ceiling and its blackened hearth, on the second day of her marriage, and had never given it up. She was sitting on the floor by the fire in an old gown, sorting through a basket of mended things for the tenants, and she was singing. Gideon stopped in the doorway. She did not stop. That was the thing. 3 years ago she would have stopped the instant a step sounded in the passage, and gone quiet, and stood up, and been ready. Now she went on singing, some slow country thing with no words he knew, and only lifted her head and smiled at him across the room as if he were the warmth coming in and not the interruption. He crossed the room and lowered himself down beside her on the hearthrug like a man half his age, and she leaned into his shoulder without being asked. The firelight moved on the ivory of her throat and on his mother's pearls, which she wore in the house, in an old gown on a Tuesday, because he had told her once that he liked to see them there. "There is a letter from Mrs. Vane," she said. "She wishes to be remembered to us. She wishes to be invited to us." "Yes." Tamsin, to mended shirt over in her hands. "I shall invite her. You are a terrifying woman. I am a well-fed one, which is a very different thing, and I had forgotten the difference." She said it lightly. But he felt her hand find his in the firelight and close on it, hard, and he understood. As he had understood 100 times in 3 years, in the small hours, in the way she still sometimes stood in a doorway waiting to be told she might come in, exactly how long a road she had walked to arrive at a hearthrug, and how far he would go to see that she never walked back down it. He raised her hand and kissed the palm of it, and folded her fingers closed over the kiss the way one closes a hand over a coin. "They poured wine on you for sport," he said quietly, "and I have never in my life been so grateful for anything, because it was the hour I stopped standing in colonnades. You would have come out sooner or later. I would not. I am a coward about exactly one thing on this earth." He turned his head and looked at her, and let her see all of it, everything he had spent 11 years learning to keep behind his eyes. "I could not think what I should do if you said no." Tamsin, Duchess of Jessamy, was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, exactly as she had on a wet road 3 years before. "Gideon, I could not have said no. I had been saying yes since November. There was simply nobody in the world who thought to ask me." The fire settled. Somewhere far off in the great house a clock struck, and the servants moved, and the county slept, and outside the tall windows of Jessamy Court, the snow began to come down over 4,000 acres that would one day belong to her sons. He drew her in against him, and she came, and the ruined muslin gown, which she had kept, and which was folded in silver paper in a drawer upstairs, claret stained and never mended, lay quietly in the dark where it belonged, not as a wound, but as the record of the night the whole world laughed at her. And one man walked 40 feet across a ballroom floor to say that he had chosen her already, and would choose her again, and would go on choosing her every day of his life, and he did.